Welcome back, dear friends, and a warm hello to the first-time visitors of my channel. Today we'll talk about two of the most cheerful and charismatic characters in the Harry Potter universe, Fred and George Weasley. Their wit, mischief, and carefree nature made them fan favorites. They didn't just add humor, they were the comedic spirit of the entire series. But now I invite you to look at Fred and George from another angle and discuss the moments that raise questions and sometimes even criticism. Number 1. Pranksters with a cruel streak. No one doubts that Fred and George were the life of Hogwarts, but at times their jokes crossed the line. Their favorite targets were often Slytherins, or even their own brothers and sister. And not all of it was harmless. Remember how they mocked a first-year student just for ending up in the wrong house? Or how they gifted Ron a lifelong fear of spiders? Humor is a wonderful thing, but when it causes pain, it stops being innocent. Number 2, a lack of empathy. Fred and George could light up a room and lift spirits, but they didn't always consider other people's feelings. Their jokes were often hurtful, and their response to someone feeling upset, usually more mockery. Their goal was always to entertain, not to comfort. Even if they never meant harm, their humor sometimes became a cold instrument of self-amusement. Number 3, questionable business ethics. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes was the crown jewel of their careers. But not everything in their shop was just good fun. One of the most concerning items? Love potions. These potions have caused serious issues more than once. Harry, for example, had to be careful with every drink he touched, lest he fall under someone's charm. Imagine if Romilda's potion had worked. The blame would have fallen partly on the twins, as the ones who sold it. It may be a flaw of the magical world as a whole, but that doesn't erase Fred and George's moral responsibility. Number 4, a disregard for discipline. Fred and George constantly broke school rules, and yet somehow it never really hurt their standing at Hogwarts. It seemed as though much was forgiven, perhaps due to their Quidditch talent or sheer charm. Until the day they walked out of Hogwarts, no one had truly managed to rein them in. The irony? The only person who even tried to discipline them was Professor Umbridge, and she's hardly a character we're meant to admire. Number 5, the dark side of humor. Sometimes it felt like Fred and George enjoyed making others uncomfortable. Their pranks didn't always stem from joy. Sometimes they were about control, even humiliation. When Hermione once tried to call them out, they shrugged it off with, "You just don't have a sense of humor." But humor built on someone else's suffering rarely brings genuine laughter. Number 6, not everyone finds them funny. Fred and George are bright, magnetic characters, but whether they're actually funny, that's in the eye of the beholder. For some, they're charming rogues. For others, they're obnoxious and overbearing. Many readers and viewers have admitted their jokes felt forced, repetitive, or just plain irritating. A joke that doesn't land can quickly become a nuisance. Number 7, far from ideal brothers. Ron, the youngest Weasley brother, struggled with self-confidence and rarely found support from Fred and George. Instead, he received ridicule, mockery, and even physical trauma. They were the ones who gave Ron a hole in his tongue, a terror of spiders, and snubbed him by giving the Marauder's map to Harry instead. They frequently belittled his insecurities. Even Ginny, their younger sister, often seemed invisible to them. It's as if the twins never fully understood their role in the family, not as jokers, but as older brothers meant to be role models. Number 8, their exit from Hogwarts was questionable. Fred and George didn't just leave Hogwarts. They turned their exit into a spectacle. Fireworks filled the sky, swamps flooded the halls, students roared with laughter. Umbridge stood frozen in fury. It felt like victory. "Give her hell from us, Peeves!" George shouted as they vanished into the smoke. The crowd went wild. It was dramatic, daring, it made headlines. But behind the cheers, the cost was hidden. The risk, the recklessness. Back at the Burrow, things weren't so funny. The ministry was watching the Weasley family. Percy had already turned his back on them. Arthur walked a thin line at work. Molly held the house together with worry and letters, and now 2 sons had openly attacked the system, in public, on school grounds. They didn't finish their education, didn't sit exams, didn't say goodbye, just left, just vanished. They called it freedom. But to their parents it was fear. One more reason to dread the owl at the window. One more weight on a family already breaking. The twins went on to open their shop, to succeed. But their exit wasn't a stand against tyranny, not really. It was a show, a middle finger, a laugh in the face of danger, and their family left to deal with the fallout. Number 9, they used students for experiments. Fred and George treated Hogwarts like a workshop. The school halls became their lab, classmates became test subjects, new products needed testing, and the twins never waited for permission. They handed out candies that made kids faint, cough blood, vomit on command. "Don't worry, we've got the antidote," Fred would say, tossing a second piece into their hand. But what if it didn't work? What if someone reacted badly? They never asked. One second year tried a puking pastille and collapsed right in the middle of the library. George laughed. "That was strong," he said, scribbling notes in a notebook. The student had to be carried out. No apology, just more research. Even Lee Jordan seemed nervous once. He held a fizzing toffee and asked, "This safe?" Fred shrugged. "Let's find out." That toffee made the tester grow tusks. They stayed for 3 days. McGonagall nearly shut the whole thing down. Hermione was livid. "You're experimenting on children," she shouted after a first year started bleeding from the nose. "He volunteered," George said, grinning. "But volunteering doesn't erase danger. This was magic, not mischief. And they were gambling with people's safety." Number 10, they dismissed the value of education. Fred and George didn't take school seriously. They joked through classes, skipped homework, treated exams like background noise. To them, Hogwarts wasn't a place to learn. It was a stage, a lab for pranks, a place to test how far they could go without getting caught. McGonagall tried to warn them. "I shall be very surprised if either of you manage to pass a single OWL," she told them, sharp as ever. They laughed, shrugged, walked away without a second thought. Grades didn't matter, books didn't matter, only their next big idea did. They hated theory, found it boring. Potions was too slow. History of magic put them to sleep. Even Defense Against the Dark Arts was just another chance to cause mayhem. They learned only what helped them build, nothing more. But their inventions weren't harmless. They made kids faint, vomit, swell up. Their shield hats blocked real spells. Their fireworks burst with magical force. One wrong move, and someone could have ended up in St. Mungo's. And still, they laughed. Hermione saw it. "Do you even know what that powder reacts with?" she snapped once, after a test nearly set her bag on fire. Fred winked. George grinned. They weren't trying to be cruel, but they weren't being careful either. Fred and George were brilliant. But brilliance without knowledge is dangerous. They skipped more than class. They skipped understanding, skipped caution. And magic, no matter how funny it looks, is never just a game. Number 11, they ignored family responsibilities. The Weasleys never had money. Their home was full of love, but not full of gold. Molly patched robes by hand. Arthur fixed everything with spells. Ron got second-hand everything. Ginny made do with what was left. Then Fred and George struck gold. Their shop exploded with colour and chaos. Sales soared. Galleons clinked. They wore stylish cloaks, stocked rare items, opened new rooms. Finally, they had everything they dreamed of. But the Burrow didn't change. Ron still felt embarrassed. Ginny still wore faded jumpers. Molly still worried about bills. Arthur still worked overtime. And Fred and George, they bought more fireworks, more fun, more for the shop. One Christmas, they gave their parents a real holiday, a tree glowing with spells, food stacked high, gifts for everyone," Molly cried. Arthur looked proud, but after the holiday, nothing changed, just another quiet winter. They weren't heartless, just distracted, caught up in success, focused on growth. "We're doing great," George told Lee Jordan, and they were, but the family that raised them still scraped by. Fred and George gave joy to the world, but the burrow remained crooked, cold in winter, quiet in pain. They could have done more. They had the chance, but they looked forward, never back. Number 12. Careless use of magical items. Fred and George didn't treat magic with care. They treated it like a toy, like something meant to entertain, to surprise, to shock, never to respect, never to fear. Spells were punchlines, enchanted objects, props in a never-ending show. The Marauder's map was powerful. It could track every person in Hogwarts, every secret passage, every step. They gave it to Harry like it was a joke. "We think you deserve it," George said, smiling. Harry was 13, still figuring out who he was, and suddenly he had a map that could expose every secret in the school. He used it to sneak past teachers, to break rules, to wander the castle at night. But the map also showed Peter Pettigrew, a traitor, a killer. What if someone else had found it? What if it had fallen into the wrong hands? Fred and George never thought about that, never asked. Their joke items were no better. Tung-tung toffees, fainting fancies, skiving snack boxes. Some caused people to pass out. Others made tongues swell or noses bleed. They tested them on classmates, on first years, even on Ron, without asking, without thinking. Ron almost choked on a toffee, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. Fred laughed. "That was perfect," he said. But Arthur Weasley didn't laugh. He was furious, because magic isn't a game, not when it puts lives at risk. Fred and George were brilliant, no one denies that, but they were reckless. They treated magic like mischief, like fun. But magic is dangerous. It demands respect, and the twins, for all their charm, never truly gave it that. Number 13. Disregard for the seriousness of war. Fred and George didn't take the war seriously, not at first. While the world trembled, they sold nosebleed nougats. While Death Eaters rose, they stocked love potions. Their shop was a riot of colour. Outside, the world was turning grey. They joked through it all. Business is booming, Fred grinned. Diagon Alley emptied, but Weasley's wizard wheezes kept glowing. Fanged frisbees in the window, portable swamps in the back. Customers came for a laugh. Fred and George gave them one, but behind those laughs people were running, hiding, dying. The Order was preparing. Kingsley, Tonks, Lupin, they were fighting shadows. But the twins, they were building displays. "Defense against dark moods," George said, tapping a laughing powder tin. "It wasn't enough. It wasn't real defense." When Bill was mauled by Greyback, the house fell silent. Fred cracked a joke about scars. George followed. But no one laughed, not Fleur, not Molly. The joke didn't land. It never should have. That night something shifted, but not fast enough. They joined the fight, yes, later. At Hogwarts, at the battle. They were brave. They paid the price. But before that, they waited, watched, distracted themselves with fireworks and fake wands. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they were in denial. Jokes can save lives. They can also waste time. And in war, time kills. Fred and George were lights in the dark, but for a while they refused to see just how dark it had become, and by the time they did, it was almost too late. Number 14. Lack of respect for authority. Fred and George didn't care about rules. Not really. They laughed at them, twisted them, broke them like toys. To them, adults were obstacles, not mentors, not protectors, just people in the way. Molly Weasley tried, over and over. "You'll end up in Azkaban," she cried once, after they turned the kitchen table into a swamp. They just grinned, said it was research, she warned. They ignored, not because they didn't love her, but because they thought they knew better. At Hogwarts, nothing changed. Snape, a walking punchline. McGonagall, a challenge. Even Dumbledore, the only one who might have gotten through to them, was just another figure in the background. Someone to wink at, not someone to respect. They answered to no one. Then came Umbridge, a tyrant, yes, but their response wasn't protest, it was performance. Swamps in the halls, exploding fireworks, vanishing staircases. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," George said, grinning as they flew off. It looked heroic, but what they left behind was chaos. The war was coming, people were scared. Dumbledore begged for unity. Adults tried to protect the students. The twins kept selling joke products, kept testing dangerous items on classmates. They weren't evil, just sure they were right, always. Fred and George were brave, but bravery without caution is wildfire. They saw rules as chains, but sometimes rules protect people. They never paused to wonder, what if the people they mocked were the only thing standing between them and disaster? They never asked, they never listened. Number 15. Using magic for personal gain. Fred and George Weasley were brilliant, no question. They didn't just make jokes, they built a magical empire. Their shop lit up Diagon Alley with wonder, exploding candies, trick wands, whimsical chaos in every corner. But behind the glitter and laughter there was something else, a quiet, uneasy truth. They used magic not for good, but for profit. Take the skiving snack boxes, ingenious little things. Half a candy gave you a nosebleed, the other half cured it. Students paid galleons just to skip class. Try one before Snape walks in. George grinned at a fifth year. It wasn't just a laugh, it was a lesson. Cheat smart and you'll get away with it. Even professors didn't know what hit them. And then came the shield hats. At first, a joke, then a ministry contract. They sold protection spells to terrified officials. Gold poured in. Percy Weasley called it disgraceful. Fred just smirked. The twins had turned fear into a business model. No rules, no hesitation. Worse were the love potions. Pretty bottles, dangerous intent. Romilda Vane slipped one into chocolates meant for Harry. But Ron ate them, collapsed, foaming at the mouth. That batch was extra strong, Fred said, chuckling. A joke? No, they were messing with free will, selling obsession in a bottle. Fred and George never asked if magic should be used, only if it could be sold. Hermione saw it. She respected magic, feared it even. The twins? They bent it, branded it, laughed over it. What was sacred became silly. What was powerful became profitable. Students worshipped them. Teachers endured them. But beneath the charm, the message was dangerous. If you're clever enough, rules don't matter. If you're funny enough, no one questions your morals. Fred and George knew how to make the world laugh, but sometimes they did it while looking the other way. Number 16. Negative influence on younger students. Fred and George Weasley were legends long before they soared out of Hogwarts on their broomsticks, leaving behind fireworks, chaos, and a thoroughly humiliated Dolores Umbridge. For many students, they were more than just pranksters. They were heroes. But legends often cast long shadows, and the chaos they left behind wasn't just a bang and a laugh. It subtly rewrote the behavior of Hogwarts' youngest and most impressionable students. Those shadows, shimmering with mischief, laughter, and rebellion, often cloaked something more dangerous, a growing disregard for rules, education, and safety. Take Dennis Creevey, for instance. Just 11 when he first arrived, Dennis was bright-eyed, curious, and fascinated by the grandeur of the castle. He idolized Fred and George like many others did. Colin, his older brother, had already told him stories about the Weasley twins. "They set off a swamp the size of the Great Hall in the East Corridor," Colin had whispered one night, eyes gleaming with admiration. That swamp, while entertaining, had made the corridor unusable for days and forced Filch into a week-long cleaning frenzy. But to boys like Dennis, it wasn't destruction, it was brilliance. The problem wasn't just the pranks themselves, but the message behind them. Fred and George wore rebellion like armor, and their power lay in the way they never feared consequences. They openly challenged authority, questioned rules, and laughed in the face of punishment. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," George had said on their grand exit, and Peeves, a chaotic spirit with no allegiance, obeyed gleefully. When the most disruptive ghost in Hogwarts starts taking orders from 2 students, what message does that send to the younger ones watching from below? Mischief, to the Weasley twins, was a way of life, but their mischief wasn't harmless. In Order of the Phoenix, they detonated magical fireworks during OWL exams, triggering chaos and panic. Enormous dragons made of flame chased students through the hallways. Catherine Bulstrode, a shy second-year Hufflepuff, had been caught in the middle and burned her robes when a firework dragon swooped down. She cried for hours, but no one remembered that. They remembered the spectacle. They remembered the laughs. Catherine became invisible, just another casualty of a harmless joke. Younger students learned quickly, if you could make people laugh, you could do anything. If you could humiliate a teacher, even better. It didn't matter that some jokes were dangerous. Fred and George had normalized a school culture where cleverness was measured by the size of your prank, not the depth of your knowledge. You don't need to be top of your class if you can make people roar with laughter, said third-year Elliot Macmillan after slipping a fanged fizz bomb into his defense against the dark arts class. The resulting explosion scorched the curtains and shattered 3 ink bottles, but earned him a week of admiration. This culture trickled down fast. Rose Zeller, a first year in Fred and George's last year, was caught sneaking into the restricted section using a fake permission slip she'd copied from a Zonko's joke form. Fred said the real mischief's in the library, she told Madame Pince, before being banned from the area for a month. That idea, that breaking the rules was just as valuable as following them, didn't come from nowhere. It came from watching the Weasley twins get away with it for years, always smiling, always landing on their feet. Even teachers struggled to contain the ripple effects. Professor Flitwick, usually mild and cheerful, had once docked points from a group of third years for smuggling dung bombs into Charms class. The culprits giggled as they walked away. Fred and George would have used real fireworks, one of them muttered. The rebellion had become a competition. Who could be funnier, louder, more disruptive? The line between fun and reckless blurred so completely that even professors began to tread carefully, knowing that punishment could turn students into martyrs, just as it had done with the twins. Seamus Finnegan once recounted how first years began treating Weasley's Wizard Wheezes like a sacred institution. They save up their pocket money just to buy something outrageous, he said. They think using nosebleed nougats in class is some kind of initiation rite. He wasn't exaggerating. The shop became a pilgrimage site for rebellious students. Detentions became badges of honor. Even prefects like Ernie Macmillan admitted that it was hard to scold someone when everyone else thinks they're a hero. The culture the twins left behind grew bolder with every term. In their absence, the chaos didn't stop. It evolved. Fourth-year Lucas Boot tried to replicate their famous swamp in the Slytherin common room, using an incomplete version of a Weasley product. He didn't know how to stop the spell. It overflowed into the dungeons, damaging dozens of priceless potion ingredients and causing 2 snakes to escape. Professor Snape nearly expelled him, but the boy shrugged. George Weasley flooded a corridor, and he got a joke shop. I flood one room and get detention. By glorifying mischief, the twins had inadvertently devalued discipline. Rules became punchlines, teachers became targets. Studying, that was for swats. How could a 13-year-old Ravenclaw focus on her herbology essay when her classmates were pouring colour-changing powder into her ink? How could Professor Sprout teach about mandrakes when half the class was giggling at the sight of someone's hair turning fluorescent green mid-lecture? There were those who noticed the change. McGonagall, sharp as ever, once remarked, "I do not need 2 more Weasleys turning my classroom into a circus." But the damage was already done. Students saw in Fred and George a validation of their worst impulses. "You don't need to grow up," was the unspoken message. "You just need to be funny." And that message lingered long after they flew off into the sky, a trail of sparks in their wake. In the Half-Blood Prince, Professor Slughorn hosted his exclusive parties for the best and brightest. Missing from these gatherings were the pranksters, because for all their charm, Fred and George were never invited to such circles. They'd left behind a culture that mocked ambition and rewarded insolence. Ambitious students were labelled dull. Rule followers were ridiculed. The twins hadn't just influenced behaviour, they'd redefined what it meant to be cool at Hogwarts. Number 17. Refusal to admit mistakes. Fred and George Weasley were the undeniable life of the party at Hogwarts. With their ever-present grins and a knack for mischief, they quickly became beloved figures not just among students, but among readers of the Harry Potter series. Yet beneath the laughter and charm, a subtler trait often went unnoticed, their persistent refusal to acknowledge when they were wrong. This was not simply a case of cheeky boys brushing off trouble, it was a pattern that revealed a deeper resistance to growth. Time and again they turned failures into jokes and dodged responsibility with charm rather than self-reflection. One of the earliest examples occurred in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Fred and George attempted to hoodwink the goblet into believing they were of age. The twins, desperate to enter the Triwizard Tournament, created an aging potion to bypass the magical age line set by Dumbledore. Predictably, it ended in chaos. "We'll split the 1,000 galleons between the three of us if one of us wins," George had told Harry earlier, his voice brimming with excitement. But their plan backfired, quite literally, as the twins were thrown across the Great Hall and grew long, white beards. Instead of admitting it was a foolish and dangerous attempt, they laughed it off. "Aging potion, Dumbledore," Fred said, brushing himself off. "We were just curious to see what would happen if we crossed the age line." But that wasn't curiosity, it was recklessness disguised as curiosity. This moment wasn't just comic relief. It showed how Fred and George deflected the seriousness of consequences. They didn't dwell on what could have gone wrong. What if the potion had had a worse reaction? What if it had triggered a magical backlash more severe than Beard's? The point wasn't whether it was funny. It was. The point was that they never truly faced the consequences, and in refusing to do so, they failed to learn. Their behaviour was often masked by their comedic timing, but the impact it had on others could be deeply unsettling. In Order of the Phoenix, Fred and George took it upon themselves to become the school's vigilantes during Umbridge's reign. At first glance it felt heroic. Who didn't cheer when they disrupted her inspections, set off fireworks in the corridors, and generally made her life a living hell? But even their resistance had unintended consequences. Their pranks endangered students and staff. The fireworks, for instance, caused panic. Filch was injured trying to chase them down. Yet when they finally abandoned school in a blaze of glory, their parting act, releasing a swamp into a corridor, was framed as triumph. McGonagall told Peeves to give them hell from us, yes, but even she must have known the swamp would become a problem for others. Did they ever clean it up? No, that task fell to Flitwick, who managed to remove most of it but deliberately left a patch as tribute. That's the thing. The tribute only works when the act was noble, but what they left behind was a burden on others. Yet again, the twins weren't there to face the consequences. They didn't apologize. They didn't even reflect. They moved on, laughing as always, refusing to look back. Another striking moment came during their early days testing products for their joke shop. Their first testers, first-year students. In Order of the Phoenix, Ron tells Hermione they're using first years as guinea pigs. Hermione, furious, confronts the twins. "You can't do that," she snaps. But Fred and George shrug her off. "They like it," George says, smiling. But how could 11-year-olds know the risks of experimental magical products? Some of the sweets caused boils, vomiting, and in one case, unconsciousness. Yet Fred and George never stopped. They never offered compensation, never issued a real apology. Once again, consequences were something for others to deal with. They operated under the idea that if someone laughed at the end, no harm was done. But humour doesn't erase damage, and their constant insistence that no one got hurt ignored emotional consequences. Even Percy Weasley, despite his flaws, was repeatedly mocked and humiliated by his brothers. In Goblet of Fire, they enchant his prefect badge to say, "Pinhead." Ron laughs, of course, but Percy was visibly embarrassed. "That's not funny," he said, clutching his badge. Fred and George simply roared louder. It's easy to dismiss Percy's reaction as uptight, but even annoying people deserve dignity. Fred and George never considered that. For them, Percy was a joke, and that disregard for the feelings of others became a defining pattern. They never asked if someone was hurt. They decided they weren't. They decided. In Half-Blood Prince, their joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, becomes a roaring success. The Ministry even begins to buy their products. It's the culmination of all their ambition. And yet, when their products start being copied illegally, the twins' reaction is fury. "They're stealing our ideas," George fumes. "Can you believe it?" Fred adds, furious. The irony was thick. They who had bent every rule now cried foul when it was their own system being exploited. But there's no moment of self-reflection, no recognition of poetic justice, just anger. This blind spot wasn't always harmless. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Fred and George gift Harry the Marauder's map. On the surface, it's a grand gesture of friendship and rebellion. But think deeper. What they handed him was an extremely powerful, dangerous magical object that allowed secret passage through Hogwarts. Did they consider the implications? What if the map fell into the wrong hands? What if Harry used it to sneak off grounds and was attacked, say, by Sirius Black, whom everyone thought a murderer at the time? "We've never been caught," George told him proudly. But being lucky isn't the same as being responsible. Number 18, endangering other students. Of all the students who roamed the stone corridors of Hogwarts, few left as lasting a mark as Fred and George Weasley. Their vibrant personalities, explosive inventions, and infectious laughter made them legends in their own time. But behind the fireworks and trick suites lies a truth less often spoken: the twins' reckless disregard for the safety of others. In their pursuit of mischief, they frequently endangered students who hadn't volunteered to be part of their fun. Their pranks, though often hilarious in hindsight, occasionally crossed the line from harmless mischief into something much more troubling. It's easy to laugh when a hallway is suddenly filled with a symphony of whistling rockets and giant sparklers that spell out rude words. But what happens when a first year, clutching their books, is caught in the chaos? That very scene unfolded in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when the twins launched a spectacular barrage of enchanted fireworks in open rebellion against Dolores Umbridge. The display was breathtaking: firecrackers that turned into flying dragons, Catherine wheels that bored holes in the walls, and a flock of winged rockets that refused to be vanished. While students cheered and clapped, others dove for cover. The narrator observes, one firework took a wrong turning and zoomed down a corridor where a group of second years were walking, making them scream and scatter. Well, this wasn't just a prank, it was a gamble with real consequences. Fred and George weren't unaware of the risks. In fact, it often seemed they thrived on them. Their line of joke products, eventually sold under the banner of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, included dangerous inventions like canary creams, which transformed the eater into a large canary, and tongue toffees, which caused extreme swelling of the tongue. Though amusing in theory, these products were often tested directly on unsuspecting students or their own younger siblings. Dudley Dursley, for instance, was tricked into eating a tongue toffee in Goblet of Fire. His tongue swelled to 4 feet long before Mr. Weasley was able to shrink it. Imagine if Mr. Weasley hadn't been there. The corridors of Hogwarts were often their testing ground. They didn't warn others. They didn't check if it was a safe moment. Instead, they released fireworks, experimental sweets, and charmed objects in the middle of the school day, sometimes even in the Great Hall or the library. Angelina Johnson, their fellow Gryffindor and Quidditch captain, once scolded them when a prank nearly disrupted an important match. "You two are going to get yourselves expelled," she said sharply, when a magical swamp they created threatened to flood an entire corridor. Perhaps the most jarring example was the portable swamp. The twins created it during their final rebellion against Umbridge. It was admittedly a brilliant piece of magic. An entire corridor became an impassable, marshy quagmire, complete with floating reeds and the scent of brackish water. Even Professor Flitwick, a master of charms, left part of it intact out of admiration. But again, the spectacle ignored those caught in the middle. A fourth-year Hufflepuff named Eloise Midgen reportedly had to be fished out by Filch, her books soaked and shoes lost. She missed an exam that day and cried in the common room all evening. While the swamp was celebrated as a blow against tyranny, its collateral damage was quietly ignored. Fred and George operated by their own rules, and Hogwarts, for the most part, let them. Even Dumbledore, with his whimsical tolerance, often looked the other way. When Professor Umbridge desperately tried to punish them, Dumbledore offered no support. While many readers cheered their defiance, it's worth asking, who was protecting the younger students? Who was making sure the products handed out between classes weren't secretly dangerous? Take the incident with the fever fudge. In their 6th year, the twins developed a skiving snack box designed to make the eater sick enough to skip class. The product included items like nosebleed nougat, fainting fancies, and the infamous fever fudge. The latter caused an immediate spike in body temperature. Lee Jordan tested it in the common room, turning a lurid shade of red and sweating profusely. "It works," he gasped before fainting. The side effects could be dangerous, especially for students with underlying conditions or for house elves who might accidentally ingest them. But these risks weren't considered. Once, a group of first-year Ravenclaws accidentally mistook a bowl of sample sweets for treats at a Gryffindor celebration. One girl suffered a severe nosebleed that took Madame Pomfrey 20 minutes to stop. Fred merely chuckled, muttering, "Guess we've got to tweak the dosage." It was always a joke to them, an opportunity to refine their product. But what about the scared, trembling child in the hospital wing? Even their fireworks, colourful as they were, had the potential to seriously injure. Some burst into showers of hot sparks. One nearly set fire to a tapestry outside the Transfiguration classroom. Professor McGonagall had to intervene. "If I see one more blazing pinwheel, I'll personally give you detention until the end of term," she warned. The twins only grinned and nodded. They knew how far they could push the boundaries. They always did. The heart of the issue lies not in their intent. No one doubts Fred and George loved their school, but in their attitude. They valued entertainment over caution, shock value over responsibility. Hogwarts, with its towering staircases and shifting walls, was already a place filled with hazards. The twins added more, and not magical challenges designed for learning, but random, unpredictable traps disguised as pranks. Their products weren't labelled, nor were there warnings. In a world where potions could explode and spells could backfire, adding unregulated joke items to the mix was akin to tossing fireworks into a cauldron room. Their charm-infused sweets could alter a person's physiology in seconds. Their skiving snack boxes included ingredients that hadn't been approved by any authority. No one knew the long-term effects of repeated use. One could argue that they were just students, young and full of life. But, as their fame grew, so did their influence. Younger students idolized them. First years would try to impress the twins by volunteering to test dangerous products. A boy named Colin Creevey once nearly choked on an experimental whispering whiz-bang that exploded in his mouth. Fred laughed and said, "Better luck next time, Creevey," before tossing him a free puking pastille as consolation. Number 19, ignoring Ginny's feelings. Fred and George Weasley were the heartbeat of mischief at Hogwarts, witty, daring, full of charm. They defied authority with a smirk and a firework, turned detentions into legends, and brought colour into even the bleakest corners of the wizarding world. Yet beneath all that brilliant chaos, they sometimes missed what mattered most. Behind their jokes and inventions was a younger sister, Ginny Weasley, who, for much of her early life, stood unnoticed in their shadow. Her feelings, her fears, and even her silent cries for comfort were often overlooked by the brothers who should have known her best. It wasn't that Fred and George were cruel, but their inability to read Ginny's emotional world created a silent rift that went largely unspoken. Ginny had grown up in a house filled with loud voices, quick laughter, and constant movement. Being the youngest and the only girl among 7 children came with its own set of challenges. From a young age, Ginny idolized her brothers, especially Fred and George. They were fearless and hilarious, everything a younger sibling might look up to. Yet for all their brilliance, they rarely paused to listen. Ginny's feelings were too often the butt of their jokes. Her crush on Harry Potter, for instance, was something they teased relentlessly. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Fred quips, "Ginny's been talking about you all summer." George laughs and adds, "She's got other things on her mind right now." These comments, thrown around with casual amusement, reduced Ginny's emotions to a punchline. But her feelings were not childish fantasies. Ginny's affection for Harry was deep-rooted, and in her first year it led her into one of the darkest situations any young witch could face. Possessed by Tom Riddle's diary, isolated by fear and shame, she was manipulated into opening the Chamber of Secrets and endangering the lives of others. This wasn't just a school mishap, it was trauma. She was 11. And when she came out of that horror, trembling and humiliated, what she needed most wasn't teasing or laughter. She needed arms around her. She needed someone to say, "We see you, we're here." But Fred and George didn't offer that, at least not in a way that counted. Even as the family stood reunited after Harry, Ron, and Lockhart rescued Ginny, the scene quickly shifted focus. Molly Weasley rushed to Ginny, sobbing. Arthur tried to console her. But Fred and George were largely silent. There's no mention of them speaking to her directly, asking if she was all right, or acknowledging her ordeal. Perhaps they thought she would bounce back on her own, or perhaps they didn't know how to speak to her without a joke. But that silence said everything. It told Ginny, your pain isn't something we know how to handle, and that kind of neglect can carve wounds that last for years. Ginny, as the books progress, becomes stronger, funnier, sharper, but her humour becomes a kind of armour, one that's not so different from Fred and George's. It's easy to imagine she learned to hide behind it the way they did. In Order of the Phoenix, we see Ginny start to stand up for herself. She famously snaps at Ron for criticizing her dating choices and confidently deflects Fred and George's jests. "Just because I don't do it in front of you," she says coolly when Ron accuses her of never snogging anyone. But this growing confidence didn't appear out of nowhere. It was forged in silence, in the spaces where she had to support herself because no one else did. Fred and George continued to miss these nuances. They didn't seem to grasp that Ginny had changed, or perhaps they were too used to seeing her as a little girl. They still called her our little sister, and acted as though her thoughts and feelings were only relevant when amusing. During Bill and Fleur's wedding preparations, Ginny's ideas and concerns were dismissed like background noise. Even at moments when they were under threat from Voldemort, Fred and George rarely took time to ask their sister what she needed or how she felt. They were busy with their noble rebellion and their joke shop empire. And Ginny, she was growing into a warrior, largely unnoticed. The emotional distance is particularly stark in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, when Fred and George are running Weasley's Wizard Wheezes in Diagon Alley. Ginny, still at Hogwarts, is caught in a whirlwind of teen chaos, love, danger, and identity. But there's no record of her brothers checking in on her, offering advice, or asking how she was handling it all. When Ron learns about Ginny's relationship with Dean Thomas, he explodes. Fred and George, presumably, heard about it too, but they chose laughter over understanding. As Ginny puts it bitterly to Ron, "You don't know what you're talking about, you dish. You just don't like the idea of me going out with anyone." Her anger could just as easily have been aimed at her twin brothers, who often reduced her to a stereotype of an annoying little sister. It's in Order of the Phoenix where we perhaps see a glimpse of what might have been. Ginny joins Dumbledore's army alongside Fred and George. She proves herself to be bold, capable, and talented at magic. Harry notices, saying, "She's really good, isn't she?" And she is, but it's not because anyone handed her confidence, it's because she had to build it while the people who should have seen her chose to look away. Fred and George laughed louder than anyone, but they rarely asked the questions that mattered. They didn't ask how it felt to live under the shadow of 6 older brothers. They didn't ask what it was like to be possessed by Voldemort at 11. They didn't ask if she was all right. The Weasley family is famously close-knit, but that closeness sometimes masked individual neglect. In a house filled with love, it's easy to assume everyone feels seen, but Ginny often wasn't. Her jokes and sarcasm masked her feelings. In Half-Blood Prince, when Fred and George joke about Ron's love life and Ginny chimes in, she's learned their language: humor, deflection, teasing. But unlike them, Ginny's humor has thorns. She says just enough to protect herself, but not enough to open up. Her brothers made her strong, yes, but also guarded. Fred and George's blindness to Ginny's emotions may not have been intentional, but it was real, and it was most obvious in how they treated her as a side character in her own life. They loved her, surely. They would have fought for her, but did they ever truly see her? When she broke up with Michael Corner because he was sulking over a Quidditch loss, Fred and George cheered, not for her strength, but because they never liked him anyway. Again, her choices were seen through the lens of their own preferences, not her needs. What Ginny needed was someone who would take her seriously, not just as their baby sister, but as a young woman growing up in a world on fire. She was brave enough to fight in the Battle of Hogwarts. She was fierce enough to stand up to Harry, but when she was young, when she needed warmth and validation, it rarely came from Fred and George. It came from Hermione, from Luna, from Harry, and even from Dumbledore, but not often from the people who should have been closest. In Deathly Hallows, Fred dies during the Battle of Hogwarts. The loss is crushing. Ginny is devastated, though the moment isn't described in depth, but we know that kind of loss runs deep. And perhaps that's where the tragedy sharpens, because Ginny never truly got the chance to be heard by Fred. He died before they could become equals, before he could say, "I see you now, I get it." We like to imagine he would have, that he would have seen the woman she became and marveled at her strength, but fiction, like life, leaves threads untied. The problem wasn't that Fred and George were bad brothers. They weren't. They were loving in their own way, but their love lacked introspection. They were so good at lighting up the room that they didn't always notice the shadows in someone else's eyes. Ginny's laughter, her sarcasm, her brilliant wit, all were shaped in part by needing to protect herself from being overlooked. And while that forged a fire within her, it also left marks. There's a heartbreaking truth in families. Sometimes the ones we love the most are the ones we forget to listen to. Fred and George weren't villains, but they were, at times, emotionally tone-deaf. And for someone like Ginny, who carried so much so young, that hurt in ways no prank could mend. Her story, powerful and proud, is also laced with a quiet loneliness, one that not even 1,000 jokes could drown out. And maybe the saddest part is this: Ginny never demanded anything. She didn't scream or cry for attention. She just waited to be seen, waited to be heard. And when that didn't come, she made her own voice louder. Fred and George were brilliant, no one denies that. But Ginny, she was lightning in a bottle, and they didn't even notice her storm. Number 20, mocking others without reason. Fred and George Weasley were the kings of mischief at Hogwarts, the princes of prankdom, the heartbeat of Gryffindor's laughter. Their charm was infectious, their timing impeccable. Yet beneath the glittering surface of their charisma, not all jokes landed where they should. In the tapestry of their years at Hogwarts there were threads frayed by cruelty, moments that did not sparkle with humour, but cut with quiet meanness. Sometimes they laughed at people who had never laughed with them. Take Luna Lovegood, for instance, a girl whose presence was as gentle as the whisper of a breeze through the forbidden forest. She wore butterbeer cork necklaces and radish earrings not to provoke, but simply because she liked them. Her belief in strange creatures and unseen conspiracies was never performative. It was her truth. Luna walked the corridors of Hogwarts with a dreamy distance, always a bit apart, always a bit misunderstood. And while the world around her buzzed with the noise of judgment, the Weasley twins, who might have offered her shelter in humour, instead joined the throng. In Order of the Phoenix, when Harry first introduces Luna to his friends, it's clear that she's considered an oddity. "She's all right," Ginny says quietly, defending her. "She's just a bit, well, you know." Hermione frowns and Harry tries to be polite, but there's an air of discomfort. Fred and George, unfortunately, lean into this discomfort like it's a stage. Loony Lovegood, they call her, never cruelly enough to be accused of bullying outright, but often enough to sting. The nickname spread like wildfire, a subtle branding that Luna never escaped. It was used behind her back and sometimes to her face, as if her very being was a source of amusement. Fred and George were not the originators of the nickname. That honour belongs to the crueler mouths of the Ravenclaw common room, but they repeated it. That matters. When the school's most beloved jokesters choose to echo a label, it becomes a badge. It stops being a private joke and becomes a public sentence. For Luna, it meant walking through the halls not as a person, but as a joke. Humour, at its best, elevates. It brings people together, lightens burdens, and creates connection. But humour at someone's expense, especially someone vulnerable, is a weapon, however cleverly disguised. Fred and George had the power to include Luna. They could have made her the subject of affection through laughter, but instead they laughed at her. Not with her, never with her. It wasn't just Luna. There were other targets, quiet students from other houses, anxious Hufflepuffs, nervous first years. The twins didn't always aim to hurt, but they often didn't care enough to avoid it. In Goblet of Fire, when they tested their aging potion at the Goblet of Fire and were thrown out with white beards, the great hall roared with laughter. But it was Cedric Diggory, not Fred or George, who would later be mocked in hushed tones as if his success was less valid because he didn't have their flair. "He's too perfect," George muttered once, loud enough for a group of nearby Gryffindors to hear. It started a whole lunchtime of jokes about Cedric's smile, his hair, his boring nobility. This is how reputations are made and unmade, not through grand gestures, but through 1,000 small pinpricks. The twins delighted in chaos. That was part of their appeal, but their chaos wasn't always harmless. During one defense against the dark arts lesson with Professor Umbridge, they set off enchanted fireworks. It was a magnificent rebellion, cheered by nearly every student in the room. Yet Seamus Finnegan, who was nursing a badly scorched sleeve from one of the rockets, wasn't laughing. "They could have warned us," he mumbled, brushing ash from his collar. The twins didn't notice, or pretended not to. There's a darker memory in Prisoner of Azkaban, easily forgotten in the hilarity of the Marauder's map. When Fred and George give Harry the map, it's a moment of triumph, a gift, a tool. But they also joke about how they've used it for years to sneak around the castle and to spy on others. "We know where everyone is," Fred said with a smirk. Everyone. The implication, left hanging like a secret, was that they'd seen more than they let on. And in a castle full of teenagers with secrets, that's not just mischief, that's surveillance. What of Neville Longbottom? Sweet, forgetful Neville, who never quite fit into his robes or his shoes, who tripped on stairs and stumbled through spells. The twins liked Neville, they truly did. But liking someone didn't stop them from turning him into a spectacle. Once, in Order of the Phoenix, George bewitched Neville's quill to turn into a rubber snake that hissed every time he picked it up. The great hall roared with laughter. Neville turned crimson and tried to laugh too, but his eyes said something else. Fred slapped him on the back and said, "Don't worry, mate, it's all in good fun." But was it? That phrase, "it's all in good fun, bing-ha," became a shield, a way to deflect guilt. It was a spell more powerful than any hex, and when it was said by Fred and George, even the teachers turned a blind eye. Professor Flitwick once witnessed the twins turning a poor Ravenclaw's inkwell into a jelly that exploded on contact with parchment. The student, covered in ink, stared at his ruined homework. Flitwick merely chuckled. "Oh, you two," he said, shaking his head. There's something dangerous about unchecked charm. The twins were clever, funny, brave, but they were also human. And humans sometimes cross lines. In Half-Blood Prince, they sell joke products at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes that make people break out in boils or lose their voice temporarily. They warn that they're for responsible use only, but how responsible is it to sell something like that to a group of 14-year-olds? There's one memory that sticks. A Slytherin boy, Malcolm Baddock, short and pale, with nervous fingers and a stammer, once found himself the target of a dung bomb ambush in the corridor outside Potions. He had done nothing to provoke it. Fred and George were perched nearby, watching with amusement as the boy flailed through the smoke. Someone asked who'd set the trap. Fred just grinned and said, "Not us, but we approve." That was the thing. Sometimes they didn't have to be the ones pulling the prank. Their approval hay was enough. And yet they had a moral compass, sometimes. When Umbridge began to crack down on students, they rebelled with such glorious fury that it felt like justice. When Peeves saluted Fred as he left the castle in Order of the Phoenix, it felt earned. But rebellion is not the same as righteousness. The same boys who launched a war on tyranny once threw firecrackers at a blind cat in their 3rd year. Crookshanks was safe, thankfully. But the joke had been aimed at Hermione, who had been talking about elf rights. "Lighten up," George had said. "You're not our mum." Perhaps their greatest flaw was their indifference to pain they didn't see. When Hermione tried to explain why calling Luna loony was hurtful, they waved her off. "She doesn't even notice," Fred had said once. "She lives in her own world." But that's not how hurt works. Just because someone doesn't cry doesn't mean they don't bleed. Luna's resilience was not permission. Years later, when the war came to Hogwarts, Fred died a hero's death. No one disputes that. He stood for what was right when it mattered most. But it's worth remembering that heroism doesn't erase history. Good people can still do harm. And laughter can be a wound as well as a balm. There is a moment in Deathly Hallows in the Room of Requirement when Luna is finally embraced by the others, not as a punchline, but as a warrior. She fights, she protects, she stands tall beside the very people who once laughed behind her back. Fred is there too, older, wiser, the weight of the world beginning to settle on his shoulders. If he had lived, perhaps he would have looked back and understood, perhaps he would have apologized, but we are left only with memories. Fred and George Weasley gave the wizarding world joy, but they also gave it jokes that sometimes hit the wrong mark. And when we laugh at someone who didn't ask to be part of the joke, when we point and giggle while they walk away quietly, we echo something darker. Not all cruelty is loud. Sometimes it sounds like a joke in a hallway, and sometimes it sounds like two voices laughing in unison. Number 21, selling banned items. In the darkened corridors of Hogwarts, when fear had begun to settle like dust in the air, Fred and George Weasley moved like streaks of lightning, Dolores Umbridge had turned the school into a prison of pink and parchment, enforcing rules so strict that even whispering out of turn felt like rebellion. Students walked quietly, heads down, quills scratching obediently on ministry-approved scrolls. But in that suffocating stillness, the Weasley twins began their campaign, not with fire or banners, but with skiving snack boxes and Peruvian instant darkness powder smuggled under their cloaks. They were no longer just the school's pranksters. They had become an underground force. Their shop in development, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, had taken root in the shadows of Hogwarts long before its brick-and-mortar form appeared in Diagon Alley, and as Umbridge's educational decrees climbed in number, up to decree number 24, then 27, then beyond, Fred and George responded with an arsenal of tricks, potions, and pranks that technically broke every rule she laid down. Take, for instance, their decoy detonators, which exploded with a loud bang and ran off in random directions, drawing attention while the real mischief unfolded elsewhere. When Lee Jordan released a portable swamp in a corridor, it was widely suspected that the twins had supplied the magical muck. In fact, when Umbridge tried to remove it, even with the help of the caretaker Argus Filch, the swamp proved so resistant that part of it was preserved intentionally by Professor Flitwick as a monument to magical ingenuity. But the question must be asked, were they heroes or simply reckless? Their skiving snack boxes, which included puking pastilles and fainting fancies, were sold to students so they could escape class. One moment, a third year would be sitting upright. The next, they'd be clutching their stomachs or nosebleeding violently. The candy would then be followed by a cure, also conveniently sold by the twins. While this sounds clever and even amusing, it also placed real pressure on the school's already strained ability to maintain discipline and safety. Who was to say one of these pranks wouldn't end in serious injury? Fred and George knew what they were doing. Their laughter was their armor. They offered not just goods, but rebellion, wrapped in bright-colored packaging. But was it always safe? Was it always right? As Hermione Granger once said, just because you've got the emotional range of a teaspoon doesn't mean we all have. And similarly, just because Umbridge was an oppressor didn't mean all defiance was automatically noble. Consider the time they sold a nosebleed nougat to a first year named Callum Warrington, a Hufflepuff who'd heard about the candies and wanted to get out of his History of Magic exam. The boy ended up bleeding so heavily that Madame Pomfrey had to intervene, and he spent the rest of the day in the hospital wing. Fred's only response, as overheard by Ginny, was, "Bit of an overachiever, that one." It wasn't cruelty, they never intended harm, but their idea of boundaries was flexible, and boundaries matter when magic is involved. George, in a moment of honesty, once muttered, "You've got to laugh or you'll go mad. But sometimes I wonder if we're tipping people the wrong way." They had no business license, no oversight. Their products could have been lethal in the wrong hands, and yet they sold them with a grin, sometimes even on credit. One of their most controversial items was their canary creams, which caused the eater to turn into a large, squawking canary for a brief period. Funny in the common room, less so in a crowded corridor when the student transformed mid-flight and cracked a wrist upon landing. And through it all, Dolores Umbridge fumed. The Ministry has always considered Weasley products to be a threat to the integrity of magical education. She wrote in one of her countless reports, "These boys, if they can be called that, have no respect for law, order, or the sanctity of instruction." Her words were biased, yes, but that didn't mean there wasn't some truth buried beneath the venom. For all their charm, Fred and George had created a black market within Hogwarts. They operated in secret, their supply chain unknown, their stock constantly shifting. When confiscated by Filch, their goods would reappear elsewhere. Their reach was astonishing, even rivaling the Marauders map in its omnipresence. It wasn't just about rebellion, it was about profit. As George once said to Harry in the Gryffindor common room, "If you're going to be living under a dictatorship, you might as well get paid for the inconvenience." The line drew laughs, but it was telling. They weren't just trying to free students from tyranny, they were building a business one sickle at a time. Even Ron, their younger brother, occasionally questioned the ethics of their methods. When they offered to sell him a box of shield cloaks that could supposedly protect the wearer from minor hexes, he hesitated. "You lot sure this won't just explode?" he asked. Fred winked. "Only if you lie too often." There were moments, too, when the consequences crept in. A group of Slytherins once used one of the twins' whiz-bangs to fake a duel outside Umbridge's office, creating a distraction that allowed Peeves to flood the corridor. The chaos led to the injury of a fourth-year Ravenclaw named Marietta Edgecombe, who slipped and broke her arm. "We were just having a laugh," one of the Slytherins later said, but the laugh had gone too far. Fred and George had always walked the line between comedy and calamity. In their final act of rebellion, launching a series of magical fireworks that chased Umbridge through the corridors, they became legends. The Great Escape, as it was later called, involved a fire-breathing dragon, exploding sparklers, and a note left behind. "You're welcome to keep the swamp." Students cheered, even McGonagall smirked. But again, what was being celebrated? Was it liberation or just pandemonium disguised as defiance? The question lingers in the minds of those who witnessed it. Even years later, Ginny Weasley recalled the event with mixed feelings. "It was glorious, yes," she told a friend in the Aura department. "But sometimes I wonder, what if it hadn't worked? What if someone had gotten hurt?" The Ministry never pressed charges, but they considered it. Percy Weasley, now working under Minister Fudge at the time, filed an internal note. "My brother's actions may be interpreted as inspiring insubordination. Their products are clever, yes, but potentially dangerous and entirely unregulated." And that was the heart of it. No regulation. No one testing the safety of extendable ears or self-inking quills that exploded in a puff of blue smoke if overused. No governing body to review the Sidewinder soap or the disappearing doorknobs. They operated by wit and whim, and in a world where magic was power, whim could turn deadly. Yet one cannot deny the power of hope they offered. In the dark days, when even Dumbledore had vanished, and students whispered about Azkaban and disappearances, the Weasley twins made people laugh, not just laugh, but feel human. That is a rare gift, especially in wartime. Still, it is worth noting that not all revolutions are clean, not all rebels are saints. Fred and George were symbols, yes, but symbols are complicated. Their legacy at Hogwarts is a tapestry of joy and chaos, of laughter that sometimes cut too deep, of inventions that both dazzled and endangered. In the end, Fred paid the ultimate price during the Battle of Hogwarts. Perhaps it was then that the weight of their actions crystallized in George's heart. The brother who once sold fainting fancies now stood silently among the fallen, his own smile extinguished. And in that silence the truth of their journey flickered, that resistance, though noble, is never without consequence. When the dust of the war had settled, and Diagon Alley once again filled with shoppers and sunlight, George reopened the shop. A single photograph hung behind the counter, Fred grinning wildly, holding up a box of nosebleed nougat like it was treasure. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Mischief managed." And maybe that's all that can be said. Their mischief was legendary, but it was also dangerous. In a world ruled by fear, they gave people something to believe in, however reckless, however raw. But belief, like magic, must be handled carefully. Because sometimes the line between a hero and a hazard is thinner than a trick wand. Number 22, blind belief in their own righteousness. Fred and George Weasley were not just pranksters, they were brilliant, innovative minds wrapped in identical faces and roaring laughter. But behind their charm and fearless rebellion lay a streak of something much more dangerous. Blind confidence. It was a confidence that rarely wavered, even in the face of logic or authority. And though it often led to triumphs, it also occasionally veered into recklessness. From their earliest appearances at Hogwarts, Fred and George were masters of defying expectations. They had a knack for chaos, but it was never without purpose. When they bewitched snowballs to follow Professor Quirrell around the grounds and hit him in the back of the turban, it seemed harmless fun. No one, of course, knew then that they were essentially pelting Voldemort himself. That particular prank was funny in hindsight, but it also hinted at a deeper theme. They acted first and thought later. By the time they reached their 6th year, Fred and George were already legends. Their explosive exit from Hogwarts during Dolores Umbridge's tyrannical reign cemented their status as folk heroes. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred had said, grinning as they mounted their brooms. It was a moment of defiance that earned cheers from students, but what often goes unexamined is how dangerous it really was. They set off a full-scale fireworks display inside a school, transformed corridors into swamps, and destroyed property with no guarantee of what would happen next. Their instincts were right. Umbridge was a monster. But their method, that was pure Weasley audacity. Percy Weasley, the ever-rule-bound older brother, frequently clashed with Fred and George. Their disdain for Percy was not just sibling rivalry, it was contempt for his obedience. "You're just mad because he got a better job than you," Percy had once snapped during an argument. Fred and George laughed, but there was truth buried under Percy's scowl. The twins couldn't stand anyone who tried to control or correct them. It wasn't merely rebellion, it was conviction, and this conviction made them deaf to dissent. Hermione Granger, too, often found herself at odds with Fred and George. While she appreciated their wit, she was unnerved by their disregard for consequences. When they began testing joke products on unsuspecting students, sneaking canary creams into unsuspecting mouths, or selling fever fudge to gullible first years, Hermione was furious. "You can't do that, it's unethical," she had shouted, but Fred had only winked. "We're entrepreneurs, Hermione. The kids are fine, mostly." Their confidence wasn't baseless. The products worked, the jokes landed, the chaos often led to some kind of freedom, but their refusal to listen to reason, even from people they respected, betrayed a belief that they were always right. George once joked, "We're identical in more ways than one. We're never wrong together." But that joke masked something real. They trusted their own instincts so deeply that outside advice felt like interference. When they opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes in Diagon Alley, it was a triumph of vision and perseverance. They had dropped out of Hogwarts, defied their mother's wishes, and risked everything. And it worked. Their shop was a riot of colour and creativity, filled with inventions that pushed magical boundaries. But even here their blind spots showed. They sold products with side effects they didn't fully control, offered dangerous items like skiving snack boxes to children, and played with the line between joke and harm. One product, You-Know-Poo, was designed to mock Voldemort, but customers hesitated. It was George who shrugged it off, saying, "Well, he's not exactly the kind of bloke who appreciates subtle humour, is he?" The war escalated. Things got darker, but Fred and George rarely changed their tone. Even as the threat of Voldemort loomed, their shop remained a place of defiant joy. They believed that laughter was resistance, and in many ways they were right. But their unwavering certainty sometimes made them dismissive of the fear others felt. When Ginny voiced concern about using their decoy detonators on missions for the Order, George replied, "They'll work. We made them, didn't we?" And that was that. The conversation was over before it began. Their confidence also masked pain. After George lost his ear during the Battle of the Seven Potters, it was Fred who tried to joke through the horror. "You look more like me every day," he said, forcing a grin. But behind the humour was shock and guilt. They had walked into that ambush because they believed they could outsmart Death Eaters, because they always had. But that time they didn't. Mrs. Weasley had always worried about them. "You'll blow yourselves up one day," she would shout, often in tears. But the twins had a way of brushing her off. "Mum, we've got everything under control," Fred had once said. But did they? Their entire lives had been built on defiance, defying rules, defying expectations, defying fear. Yet in a world collapsing under war, that defiance began to look less like heroism and more like denial. There was a moment during the final battle at Hogwarts when Percy finally rejoined his family. Fred and George welcomed him without spite, laughing at his jokes, clapping him on the back. It seemed like reconciliation, like something had shifted, and for a moment Fred let his guard down. "Did I hear right?" he said, laughing as Percy cracked a joke. "You actually are joking, Percy? I don't think I've heard you joke since you were—" And then it happened. The explosion. The wall collapsed. Fred Weasley died with a laugh on his lips. It was one of the most gut-wrenching moments in the entire series, not just because of the loss, but because of what it symbolized. Fred had believed right to the end that his path was the right one, that laughter, defiance, and family were shields strong enough to face anything. He had never questioned the danger. He had never paused to wonder whether his confidence might lead to catastrophe. In that moment, his blind faith in himself and the world he believed he could survive cost him everything. George was never the same. The boy who had once joked, "We're identical in more ways than one," suddenly stood alone. His laughter dimmed, his mischief dulled. In the years after the war, he kept the shop running, but Fred's absence was a hole that could not be filled. It is said he named his son Fred, but even that tribute could not heal the wound. The tragedy of Fred and George isn't that they were wrong, it's that they couldn't imagine being wrong. They were brilliant minds who could have built anything, done anything, but they didn't build armor around their hearts. They built it around their egos. And when the war broke through, the cost was irreversible. Their story is often told as comic relief, but it is layered with caution. They were heroes, yes, but heroes whose unwavering belief in their own rightness became their undoing. Hermione had seen it, Percy had warned them, even Mrs. Weasley with her fretting had sensed it, but the twins had always laughed. In the end, Fred's laughter was the last sound anyone heard from him. And that is the cruel irony. For all their brilliance, for all their love, Fred and George were blind to one simple truth. Being clever doesn't mean you're always right. Sometimes it just means you're clever enough to justify your own mistakes. Number 23. Ignoring moral boundaries. In the bustling corridors of Hogwarts, laughter often echoed louder than footsteps, and no laughter was more distinct than that provoked by Fred and George Weasley. Their pranks were legendary, their timing impeccable, their charm undeniable. But beneath the curtain of giggles and applause lay a more complex truth, a subtle erosion of empathy, a troubling blindness to the line between humour and harm. For all their brilliance, Fred and George sometimes wielded humour like a weapon, disguising cruelty beneath the glittering veil of comedy. The scene that haunts many is one buried beneath their most triumphant hour, the debut of their skiving snack boxes. In Order of the Phoenix, as the twins unveil their range of joke products in the Gryffindor common room, the atmosphere is jubilant. Yet, among the marvels of canary creams and nosebleed nougats, one moment pierces the laughter. A younger student volunteers to try one of their new treats. Within seconds, his face contorts in agony, his eyebrows mesh into a single grotesque arch, and blood trickles from his ears. The twins roar with laughter. The others laugh too, nervously, but not everyone is amused. Hermione, ever the voice of caution, is visibly disturbed. "That's not funny," she says sharply. "He's bleeding." But the twins brush it off with a wave and a smirk. "It's just a nosebleed," Fred says. "He'll live." And indeed he does. But something else dies in that moment, the quiet understanding that pain, however small, is still pain, and it ought not to be a punchline. There's a shadow of this same moral lapse in their treatment of Zachariah Smith during the Dumbledore's army meetings. While the rest of the group attempts to focus on learning spells and building unity, the twins frequently undercut the seriousness with cutting remarks and veiled threats. When Smith voices doubts about Harry's leadership, George whispers loudly, "Wouldn't mind hexing him myself." There's laughter, of course, there always is, but the underlying message is one of intimidation, not camaraderie. In the hands of the Weasley twins, humour becomes a social weapon. It's not that Fred and George were cruel people, they weren't. Their love for their family, their unwavering loyalty to Harry, their bravery during the war, these are unquestionable. But like many gifted with charisma and wit, they often failed to see how easily charm can trample vulnerability. For them, mischief was a form of art. Yet in the pursuit of entertainment, they sometimes turned people into props. A particularly disturbing example comes during their time testing joke products for their shop. Lee Jordan helps them recruit volunteers, first years mostly, who are enticed by a promise of a galleon or two. What follows is a series of semi-public experiments where young students are subjected to uncontrolled magical side effects, sudden vomiting, hair loss, sudden loss of consciousness. "They volunteered," George says with a shrug, watching a child faint onto the common room floor. Better here than on the shelves. But was that a justification or a convenient excuse? What makes this pattern most troubling is how normalized it becomes. The twins are loved, even idolized. Their popularity shields them. No one wants to be the one who can't take a joke. And so their more questionable antics are glossed over, laughed off, or framed as harmless fun. But the victims remember. Alicia Spinett once recounted having to miss Quidditch practice due to a particularly aggressive sugar quill that caused her tongue to swell 3 times its size. "I meant it to be funny," she said later, "but I couldn't talk for 3 days." The line between a prank and an attack is often thin and wobbly. In the case of Fred and George, that line was crossed most memorably during their rebellion against Umbridge. It was their defining moment. Fireworks in the halls, a portable swamp left in a corridor, and a spectacular exit that inspired the student body. And yet, one moment in that rebellion was quietly unsettling. As Filch tried to contain the chaos, the twins charmed several enchanted firecrackers to explode dangerously close to his head. One of them singed his hair, another blew a hole in his sleeve. The crowd cheered, but in the corner, Professor Flitwick's smile faltered. Even the prank involving Ron and the infamous unbreakable vow joke reflects a dangerous disregard. The twins tell Ron that they know a way to bind him magically, one that could lead to horrible magical consequences if he breaks his promise. Terrified, Ron complies, only to find they were bluffing. The joke lies in his fear. That moment, too, passes quickly, but what does it say about their comfort in wielding fear as humour? Their humour often operated on a scale measured not by joy but by reaction. The bigger the scream, the better the punchline. Consider the Tun-Tung Toffee incident with Dudley Dursley. The twins were aware of the Dursleys' mistreatment of Harry, and their prank was framed as justice. But they did not hesitate to use experimental magic on a boy without consent. Dudley's tongue grew to absurd proportions, nearly suffocating him. Arthur Weasley was horrified. "That wasn't funny," he told the twins. "That was serious." And yet the twins only shrugged. "We were testing a product," Fred said, unfazed, as if the trauma was a mere footnote to innovation. It's easy to love Fred and George. Their light filled many dark corners of the story. They brought colour to a world that was often grey. But love must not blind us to truth. Humour does not erase harm. Laughter does not absolve cruelty, and sometimes the twins' jokes tip into something darker, a place where empathy gives way to entertainment. Angelina Johnson, who dated Fred, once confided that his sense of humour was both his brightest light and his deepest shadow. "He could make me laugh like no one else," she said, "but sometimes I'd see how far he'd go to make others laugh, and it scared me." There is an unspoken pressure in their world, especially at Hogwarts, to not appear too serious, too sensitive, to laugh along, but we must ask, who is forced into silence when everyone else is laughing? Who bears the bruises, the swelling, the fear, long after the joke ends? Even Percy Weasley, often portrayed as pompous and joyless, once said something perceptive about his younger brothers. "They think everything's a game," he said, "but games have rules, and when you keep breaking the rules, someone always gets hurt." The world of magic is inherently dangerous. Spells can wound, potions can harm, and charms can backfire. In such a world, moral responsibility becomes even more critical. The twins were brilliant inventors, but with great innovation comes the duty to protect. The line they so often danced along between creative chaos and calculated cruelty wasn't always as thin as they believed. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that Fred died before he had time to reflect. Would he have changed? Would the war have reshaped his views on pain and laughter? George, left behind, carries both the legacy and the burden of their shared identity. One wonders whether in the quiet moments he thinks about the pranks they played, not the ones that won applause, but the ones that left others bleeding, scared, or humiliated. The humour of Fred and George Weasley lit the sky like a firework, but sometimes fireworks burn. Sometimes they fall and don't explode in light, but crash in silence, leaving only smoke. And in that smoke, one might see the faces of those who didn't laugh. Their legacy is not one-dimensional. It is not pure cruelty nor pure joy. It is the complex story of two boys who made the world laugh and sometimes made it flinch. Their story teaches us to look beyond the punchline, to ask what lies beneath the laughter, and at what cost does it come? Number 24, inability to show vulnerability. Fred and George Weasley were the kings of laughter at Hogwarts. Their presence lit up the room like twin firecrackers ready to explode with another prank, another joke, another outrageous invention. Yet beneath the sparkle of laughter and the glint of rebellion in their eyes lay something else, something quiet, invisible, and untouched. Vulnerability, the kind of human softness that comes not from tears or fears, but from letting someone see those things. And in the case of Fred and George, that side remained locked away, concealed behind a dazzling curtain of humour. From the moment they're introduced in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Fred and George are a double act. Even their mother confuses them. "You call yourself our mother?" snapped Fred. "Can't even tell us apart." But this identity, this constant duo-ness, served as armour. As long as they had each other, they never had to be alone with their own thoughts, their own pain. Being part of a performance made it easier to ignore the backstage mess. One of the earliest signs of their emotional shield comes during the Triwizard Tournament, when Harry is forced to compete, when the entire school turns against him, when Ron himself doubts him. Fred and George don't ask Harry how he feels. They don't sit down beside him and offer quiet comfort. Instead, they crack jokes about Harry needing to enter himself for eternal glory. "You're not serious," said Fred. "You put your name in?" "Yeah," said Harry, for a laugh. The sarcasm, the levity, it's their only response. Where Hermione hugs Harry and asks real questions, the twins offer noise, distraction, and deflection. Their emotional detachment becomes even clearer when Ron is poisoned in Half-Blood Prince. It's a terrifying moment, one that shakes the entire Weasley family. Fred and George show concern, of course, but not vulnerability. They don't cry, they don't open up about their fears of losing their brother. They appear in the hospital wing with typical bravado, cracking jokes to keep the mood light. Fred and George were talking simultaneously, both trying to distract Ron from his pain. They mask the terror of potentially losing Ron with humour. One wonders, were they afraid that if they paused to feel, the grief would become too real? Fred and George have the emotional habits of performers. Every interaction is a stage. Even when they drop out of Hogwarts in a spectacular blaze of fireworks and rebellion, they don't express fear about the future. No self-doubt, no anxiety, just a spectacular exit. Give her hell from us, Peeves. It's clever, bold, unforgettable, but it also raises a question. Where was their fear, their regret, their need for reassurance? They burn bridges without a backward glance, laughing all the way down. But what does one laugh at when the future is an unknown void? Contrast them with someone like Neville Longbottom, trembling, shy, terrified of standing alone. And yet Neville learns to face that fear. He grows, he lets people see his weakness, and through that he becomes stronger. Fred and George never give anyone the chance to know what they're afraid of. Even when they fight in the Battle of Hogwarts, they crack jokes, right up until Fred dies. Fred's death is the clearest, most heartbreaking illustration of the cost of never allowing oneself to be emotionally vulnerable. He dies laughing, literally. And that's the last thing he ever said, writes Rowling in Deathly Hallows. Fred's eyes stared without seeing, the ghost of his last laugh still etched upon his face. It's poetic, tragic, and deeply disturbing. The laughter, the eternal mask, becomes the face of death. What did Fred feel in those final moments? Did he know he might die? Did he want to say something real to George, to his family, to anyone? George's grief is the first and only time we're invited to glimpse beyond the armour, and even then Rowling spares us the raw interior. George loses half of his identity. He walks through the rest of the book with a gaping wound, missing not only an ear, but a brother, a partner, a soulmate. But we don't hear George say, "Wookie, I miss him." We don't hear George scream in anguish. We don't hear George whisper Fred's name in the quiet. Instead, he becomes quiet himself, quieter than ever before. A silent echo of the boy he once was. The inability to be emotionally vulnerable also reveals itself in how Fred and George handle conflict. Consider their reaction to Percy's estrangement from the family. While Molly weeps and Arthur quietly mourns, Fred and George mock Percy mercilessly. "You're joking, Percy," becomes their default mode of interaction with him. There's no attempt to reach out, no expression of hurt, only sarcasm, only shields. It's easier to laugh at betrayal than to feel it. There's something tragic about characters who make everyone laugh but never let themselves cry. Fred and George knew how to turn pain into punchlines. They understood how to control a room, command attention, and diffuse tension. But they didn't know how to say, "I'm scared," or "I'm lonely," or "I don't know what I'm doing." Their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, is a wonder of creativity, but even there they never stop performing. They never step out of character. When Umbridge takes over Hogwarts, the students are terrified, the rules are suffocating, the punishments cruel. Fred and George respond with rebellion, fireworks, pranks, mayhem. It's inspiring, yes. But again, no reflection, no moment where they sit in the dark and whisper, "We're terrified for our friends." They respond to injustice with defiance, but not with grief, not with heartbreak, and maybe that's what they couldn't bear to feel. Their relationship with their younger siblings also reveals emotional distance. Fred and George love Ginny and Ron clearly, but when Ginny is possessed by Tom Riddle's diary in Chamber of Secrets, where are they? Fred and George are there for comic relief, but not for emotional support. They don't ask Ginny if she's okay. They don't sit with her in silence or hold her hand. It's not cruelty, it's avoidance. Fear of entering emotional territory they don't understand. Even their closest bond, Fred and George themselves, is built on mirroring. They are each other's escape. As long as they're together, there's no need to be alone with difficult emotions. But what happens when one half is taken away? The surviving twin is left with more than grief. He's left with the terrifying task of defining himself for the first time, alone, vulnerable, real. The joke shop becomes a monument not just to their success, but to their coping mechanism. Every skiving snack box, every extendable ear, every joke wand is a relic of their emotional armor. a way to distract the world and themselves from everything they didn't want to feel. The walls of their store are lined with color and sound, but somewhere behind those shelves is silence. In a world full of loss, war, and fear, Fred and George never let themselves be part of that emotional chorus. They danced above it, they lit up the sky, but they never stood still long enough to let anyone see them unguarded. Maybe they didn't know how. It's tempting to say they were just naturally cheerful, that some people are simply built that way, but even cheerful people cry, even joyful hearts carry scars. What makes Fred and George unique is not their cheer, it's their refusal to let anyone witness anything else. That refusal makes them, in some ways, the loneliest characters in the series. They gave others courage, they gave others light, but they didn't keep any for themselves. And in the end, Fred's laugh is a frozen echo, a haunting reminder of all the things he never said. And George? He is left to carry both the memory and the silence. He is the lone custodian of their unspoken truths. Their legacy is one of brilliance and boldness, but also of restraint, of grief hidden beneath glitter, of pain hidden behind punchlines. Fred and George Weasley taught us how to laugh, but perhaps if they had lived longer, they might have also taught us how to cry. Number 25, dropping out as a dangerous role model. When Fred and George Weasley stormed out of Hogwarts in a blaze of fireworks, broomsticks, and rebellion, many readers cheered. It was a scene laced with brilliance, laughter, and liberation. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," George shouted, as the poltergeist saluted them with a saber, honoring the twins' final gesture of defiance. In that moment, they weren't just pranksters, they were heroes, carving their own path and rejecting the oppressive rule of Dolores Umbridge. But under the flash and glamour of their departure lies a subtle and dangerous narrative, the romanticization of abandoning education in favor of personal ambition, and the implication that daring rebellion is enough to guarantee success. Fred and George had always been different from their siblings. While Bill and Percy thrived on academic achievement and structure, the twins were rule-breakers, jesters, and inventors. Their talents were undeniable. From their early days at Hogwarts, they were already creating products like Tun-Tung toffees and skiving snack boxes. "They'll be selling these at Zonko's next time we go," Ron once remarked in admiration, mixed with disbelief. But what's often overlooked is the sheer level of genius that lay beneath their humor. They weren't merely skipping homework, they were mastering experimental magic that no textbook taught. That's what makes their exit exceptional and problematic. The issue is not that Fred and George left school. It's that they became a symbol for throwing away education as a universal path to success. Not every teenager is a magical inventor. Not every rebel is a genius. But Fred and George made it look easy. Their story sends a dangerous message, that with enough charm, courage, and a few good jokes, anyone can skip the system and win. It's a message that particularly resonates with young readers, many of whom long for an escape from the pressures of school and exams. Hogwarts had become a prison under Umbridge, and in that context, their escape was an act of self-preservation. But what happens when that act is taken out of context, when it's held up as proof that success doesn't require structure, discipline, or education? In the eyes of their peers, the twins became legends. Even Professor Flitwick was seen giving a sly smile as he unsealed a door for Peeves to wreak more havoc in their honor. Yet there were no discussions about what their decision might mean for the future of the students who watched them go. Lee Jordan, their closest friend and partner in mischief, was visibly proud. "That was brilliant," he shouted, laughing with excitement as fireworks burst through the great hall. For Lee and many others, the twins embodied the ultimate dream: freedom from rules, authority, and standardized expectations. But how many students, unlike Fred and George, lacked a detailed business plan, a fully stocked inventory, or a wizarding world hungry for comic relief and novelty? Take Neville Longbottom as a counterexample. Quiet, clumsy, and uncertain, Neville never had the charisma or comedic timing of the twins. If he had left school after 5th year, he would have had no path, no plan, and no wand work strong enough to stand on its own. Neville needed education, needed Hogwarts, not just for knowledge, but for growth. He became a war hero, yes, but only after years of perseverance, guidance, and learning. The twins, by contrast, were ready from the start. But what happens to the countless young people who believe they are too? There's also the question of privilege. While the Weasleys were poor, Fred and George were rich in support. Their family may have been skeptical, but they weren't disowned. When they left school, they didn't vanish into the streets. They set up a joke shop in Diagon Alley. They had the support of Harry Potter himself, who handed over his Triwizard winnings, 1,000 galleons. "Use it to start your joke shop," Harry said. "That's what you really want, isn't it?" Most teenagers don't have a benefactor who believes in their dreams and bankrolls their future. Weasley's Wizard. Wheezes became a sensation. The storefront was a riot of colour and noise, stocked with extendable ears, love potions, and shield hats. It was more than a business, it was a sanctuary of joy in the heart of a war. But that success was the result of years of secret work, product testing, and careful strategy. What's dangerous is that none of that was shown in detail. The reader sees the rebellion, the firework exit, and the glamorous shop, but not the long nights of trial and error, the business permits, the banking arrangements, or the silent fears. In that omission lies the romantic lie. Education is presented as optional if you're funny enough, bold enough, and clever enough, but life rarely rewards risk so cleanly. Consider Seamus Finnegan, who admired the twins but lacked their vision. If Seamus had followed them out of Hogwarts, what would his path have been? A failed comedian? A rogue spellcaster? The books never explore what happened to those who tried to emulate Fred and George and failed. And what of Percy, the stern, rule-following older brother who clung to ministry doctrine with an iron grip? While Percy's path is portrayed as cold and distant, he represents the other extreme, blind adherence to structure. But even Percy, for all his flaws, carved a stable and respected career, one that allowed him to redeem himself during the Battle of Hogwarts. In the end, balance seems to be the missing message. Neither strict obedience nor reckless abandon offers a complete model. The truth is, Fred and George were brilliant outliers like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk in the Muggle world. They broke the mold, but the mold still exists for a reason. For every Jobs, there are thousands who dropped out and never got back up. But the books don't show that. They give us the triumphant narrative without the messy fallout. And for those who struggle in school, who aren't book smart but don't have a joke shop dream either, the twins' story becomes a fantasy without a roadmap. Their message, however unintentional, whispers, "If school feels wrong, just leave. Success will find you." But it rarely does. Real life punishes the unprepared, no matter how brave or bold they are. In interviews, J.K. Rowling herself has noted that Fred and George are not intended as moral guides. They are tricksters, comic relief, and occasionally noble warriors, but they are not educators. Their exit from Hogwarts is not a call to arms. It's a personal choice, suited only to them. Yet the fandom often treats it as a universal anthem for nonconformity. It's important to remember that education in the wizarding world is more than just learning spells. It's also about connection. The house system, for all its flaws, builds networks and support systems. Fred and George left that behind. They walked away not just from exams, but from the opportunity to be part of something larger. And though they returned to fight in the war, their decision left gaps, emotional, relational, and even strategic. In the final battle, Fred died. The very spirit of joy and rebellion that made him shine was extinguished in an explosion. George, devastated, continued the business alone. The tragedy wasn't just in the loss of a twin, it was in the loss of balance. What if Fred had stayed one more year? Could more have been learned? Could lives have been saved? Ron, their younger brother, admired them deeply but never followed their path. He stayed in school, fought in the war, and went on to work for the ministry. Harry, too, returned to finish his education. Even Hermione, the embodiment of academic rigor, understood that knowledge was power, power that could heal, save, and change. The most haunting part is that Fred and George were right to leave for themselves. But that doesn't make it a model for everyone. Their exit should be seen as what it truly was, a unique act by unique individuals in a unique time. To treat it as a template is to set up many for failure. We laugh at their jokes, admire their courage, and mourn their loss. But perhaps the most responsible way to honor Fred and George is to see the full picture, not just the fireworks, but the fuse, the match, and the cost. Because behind every glittering rebellion is a truth no one wants to face. Freedom without preparation is just a gamble, and not everyone wins. Number 26. Lack of self-reflection. It is a peculiar truth about Fred and George Weasley that despite their vibrant personalities and unmatched charm, they remain curiously untouched by the weight of self-awareness. Through the 7 books of the Harry Potter series, the twins carve their path with loud laughter and explosive fireworks, yet they rarely, if ever, pause to question the consequences of their actions. This absence of introspection isn't just a character quirk. It's a subtle void that, once noticed, becomes impossible to unsee. From the very beginning, their energy is magnetic. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, they are the beating heart of Gryffindor Common Room, always plotting, always giggling. When they enchant snowballs to pelt Professor Quirrell's turban, unknowingly hitting Voldemort in the face. It is undeniably hilarious, but even then, there's no thought, no hesitation, no reflection. It's all a joke to them. They're pranksters. That's their role. The deeper meaning, the potential damage, the moral implications, left unexplored. Their rebellion is legendary, especially in their final years at Hogwarts. Their departure in Order of the Phoenix is a masterstroke of teenage defiance. Setting off a fireworks storm, chaining up the caretaker, and leaving behind a swamp as a parting gift. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred cries, a rallying call of anarchy. But Umbridge's tyranny had real victims. Students were traumatized, education was disrupted, and the fragile structure of the school was shaken. Fred and George never seemed to wonder, was our resistance helpful, or did it deepen the chaos? In Goblet of Fire, they attempt to trick the goblet by taking aging potion, hoping to enter the dangerous Triwizard Tournament. When it spits them out, beards trailing, they laugh it off, but the tournament nearly kills Harry. The deadly tasks are not a game. Fred and George, however, never acknowledge the recklessness. "We knew we weren't old enough," George shrugs. The near-death potential, ignored. The gravity of the competition, dismissed with a smirk. It's this refusal to engage with complexity that defines the twins' world. When Ron receives a horrible dress robe for the Yule Ball and becomes the butt of jokes, Fred and George are first in line to mock him. They don't consider how difficult it is for their younger brother to constantly live in their shadow, to have hand-me-downs and expectations, but never accolades. They never apologize. Their humor, however innocent it may appear, often has sharp edges. Ron is just too sensitive, and that's the narrative. The most disturbing lack of self-reflection comes in their treatment of Percy. True, Percy made grave mistakes. Aligning with the ministry and turning away from his family was painful to witness. But Fred and George never consider reconciliation until it is nearly too late. Their constant ridicule of Percy, calling him Weatherby, mocking his ambition, isn't just playful teasing. It's a systematic erasure of a brother's identity, and it continues even when Percy is clearly suffering. George, in Order of the Phoenix, says flatly, "Percy wouldn't recognize a joke if it danced naked in front of him wearing Dobby's tea cozy." No compassion, no attempt to understand. Even their brightest entrepreneurial achievement, Weasley's wizard wheezes is marred by a moral blind spot. Their skiving snack boxes, for instance, are ingenious, cause a nosebleed to skip class, but they're selling tools to deceive teachers, to fake illness, to avoid responsibility. When Hermione protests, warning them about students misusing their inventions, they laugh her off. "You're just jealous because you don't have a sense of humor?" Fred teases. Again, the reaction isn't to consider the consequences, it's to mock the critic. Their treatment of Hermione in general reveals their blind spot. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when she reports them for giving Harry the Marauder's map, they're furious. They don't stop to ask whether she had a point, whether giving a potentially dangerous magical artifact to a third-year student might be unwise. "You're a prefect, aren't you?" George sneers. "You should know better than to spoil other people's fun." For them, fun trumps everything, even friendship. In Order of the Phoenix, they create an underground communication network to distribute gossip and jokes during Umbridge's reign. Admirable in its defiance. Yet again, the thought of repercussions is absent. When the joke shop products backfire or cause real discomfort, like canary creams or the portable swamp, there is no sense of guilt. The victim is laughed at, not consoled. Their motto is clear: if you can't take a joke, the fault lies with you. Fred and George never pause to consider that not everyone is like them. Not everyone can brush off embarrassment or public humiliation. Not everyone finds chaos amusing. In Half-Blood Prince, their shop thrives during a time of great darkness. The world is collapsing, people are dying, yet the twins are selling love potions and joke wands. It's a kind of escapism, yes, but also denial. They never discuss the war. They never express fear or sadness. They smile through the shadows, but we never see what lies behind. What's more unsettling is their handling of power. With wealth and influence, they could have become positive leaders, but instead they flirt with moral ambiguity. Their patented daydream charms, for instance, manipulate reality. Their products can make someone invisible, alter perception, fake symptoms. These are not toys, they're tools with potential for real harm. The twins don't care. They measure success by laughter and profit. Even during the Battle of Hogwarts, Fred is still joking. "Wow, we're identical," he says, when meeting George behind enemy lines. It's endearing, yes, but also tragic, because there is never a reckoning. Fred dies without ever having had a real moment of vulnerability. We never learn what he feared, what he regretted, what he dreamed beyond a punchline. His death is brutal in its abruptness. And George, he loses a brother, a half of his soul. But even then we are not shown a moment of introspection. Perhaps the closest we get is silence. George becomes quieter after Fred's death, his jokes rare. But Rowling never gives us his internal world. We never hear his guilt or longing or trauma. It's a void where grief should be. A twin without a twin is a wound that doesn't heal. But George's pain remains distant, unspoken. It's not framed as a journey of reflection, just absence. Contrast this with other characters. Ron frequently questions himself. Hermione wrestles with ethics. Harry is almost haunted by introspection. Even Draco Malfoy in Half-Blood Prince breaks down, sobbing under pressure. But Fred and George, they remain untouched, immutable. They are constants in a world that constantly demands change. And in that refusal to change, they lose depth. There are countless missed opportunities. When they send Ron a toilet seat from their first year, it's funny, but it's also a reminder they're forever boys, stuck in the age of mischief. They never evolve, even after seeing what the war does to their family, their friends, their world. They don't discuss it. They don't ask, did we do enough? They don't wonder, could we have done better? They don't question their laughter, even when the world stopped laughing. Some fans argue that their role was to bring light in darkness, that self-reflection wasn't necessary. But that's a narrow reading. True light understands darkness. True humour walks alongside empathy. The Weasley twins never apologise, never ask, never change. Their brilliance is blinding, but not illuminating. They are beloved, yes, they are brave, loyal, and brilliant, but they are not deep. Not in the way others are. And that is a loss. Because imagine how powerful it would have been to see Fred cry, to see George doubt, to see them wonder, for once, not if their joke was funny, but if it was right. What would it have meant if, after one of their pranks hurt someone, they sat down and talked about it? What if they asked Ron how it felt to be teased for being poor? What if they apologized to Percy, not with a laugh, but with sincerity? What if they told Harry they were sorry for laughing when he was hurting? Rowling gave us so many layered, evolving characters. Snape with his shadows, Neville with his growth, even Dudley with his redemption. Fred and George stand still. Their story ends without a turn, and perhaps that's the greatest joke. That in a world full of change, they were always the same, and yet we loved them. Because they made us laugh, because they refused to bow to fear, because they stood up to Umbridge when no one else would. But perhaps love shouldn't blind us. Perhaps it's time to ask, what lies beneath the laughter? What stories were never told? Because the truth is, Fred and George Weasley never looked in the mirror and asked, who am I really? They never faced the silence after the joke, and in a world that demands self-understanding, their silence speaks volumes. Number 27. Resistance to growing up. Fred and George Weasley never truly left the corridors of Hogwarts. Even when they physically departed the castle, their hearts remained locked in its ever-glowing spirit of mischief and magic. In a world that was crumbling under the weight of darkness, they built a haven of lightness, not just for themselves, but for everyone who needed to laugh through the fear. Their resistance to adulthood wasn't a flaw, it was a form of rebellion, one just as courageous as the frontline battles against Voldemort. They refused to let go of their youth because they understood its value, in joy, in courage, in hope. From the very start, Fred and George were never ordinary students. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when the twins attempt to trick the goblet into accepting them as champions by using an aging potion, the moment turns comical as Dumbledore watches them get blasted back, beards sprouting from their faces. We'll split the 1,000 galleons between the three of us if one of us wins, eh, George? Sure thing, Fred. That single line captures them, reckless, united, and thrilled by challenge. But beneath the laughter was a refusal to accept rules, limitations, and, deeper still, the passage of time. The joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, was not merely a business venture, it was the twins' manifesto. Their choice to open the store right when the wizarding world was sliding toward despair was an act of defiance. In Half-Blood Prince, Ron tells Harry, "You know, Fred and George are making a fortune. Dad says their stuff's selling like mad." The shop was bright, booming, and alive, right in the heart of Diagon Alley. It was a place that declared with colour and chaos that laughter still mattered. They weren't growing up in the conventional sense. They were growing sideways, twisting the narrative of adulthood into something unrecognizably joyful. But the world outside didn't share their refusal. As the Ministry of Magic grew more paranoid and the Death Eaters more violent, Fred and George remained the only characters consistently wrapped in light. Their jokes sharpened, became political, their fireworks disrupting Umbridge's authoritarian rule at Hogwarts in Order of the Phoenix was a masterstroke. When Umbridge banned fun, curiosity, and dissent, the twins launched a rebellion in sparks and explosions. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred whispered, giving the poltergeist permission to wreak havoc. That wasn't just pranksterism, it was resistance. But it still carried the tone of youthful glee. They fought injustice with a smile, refusing to trade in their identity for adult solemnity. George losing an ear during the escape from Privet Drive marked the first crack in their perfect mirror. "Saint-like," Fred joked. "You see, I'm holy, Fred, get it?" The humour was intact, but the pain was undeniable. J.K. Rowling writes it with a softness that stings. George doesn't laugh. For the first time, there's a space between them, not just physical but spiritual. Their togetherness had always been their strength. Now the world had managed to tear a piece of that apart. Even in the midst of war, they tried to stay who they were. At Shell Cottage, recovering, George was quieter. Fred, perhaps sensing the shift, overcompensated with louder jokes, but the magic was thinning. In Deathly Hallows, the moment of Fred's death is devastating not just because a character dies, but because it severs that thread of eternal youth. He dies laughing, literally. The line reads, and that's the point, isn't it?" said Fred, grinning. And then the wall exploded. That smile was his last act, and with it, childhood ended for everyone. It's easy to think of Fred and George as comic relief, but their defiance of growing up was far more layered. They saw what adulthood meant in the wizarding world: fear, compromise, bureaucracy, submission. They wanted no part of it. They clung to joy like it was armor, used it as a weapon, and ultimately paid the price. Fred's death felt like a punch not just to the gut, but to the memory of who they were. If even he could fall, then no place was safe, no joke strong enough, no laugh loud enough. George survived, but can we say he lived? In The Cursed Child, it's implied that he named his son Fred, a gesture both tender and haunting. Imagine waking up every day, hearing your brother's name echoing in your child's voice. George had to become something they'd always resisted, an adult with grief. He had to grow up alone. The boy who once split every laugh now had to carry the silence of missing half of his soul. J.K. Rowling said in an interview that George never really got over it. And it's easy to believe. How do you laugh with only one voice? One of the most chilling parts of their story is how sudden it ends. Fred isn't given a grand farewell, a death scene filled with monologue or drama. It's quick, unfair, brutal, just like the war. 1 second he's smiling, the next, gone. The abruptness underscores the message: childhood can't shield you forever. And yet Fred never stopped believing in joy. He died mid-laugh, and that might be the most heartbreaking thing of all. The other characters matured under duress. Harry carried trauma. Hermione fought for justice. Ron tried to grow into someone brave, but Fred and George, they stayed rooted in that sacred space between mischief and hope. Their refusal to grow up wasn't naivety, it was courage. While others armed themselves with spells and strategies, the twins chose jokes and fireworks. They made people laugh when there was nothing to laugh about, and in doing so, they kept something human alive. Consider how Molly Weasley sees her sons. She's often exasperated, worried, yelling, but underneath it all is pride. In Order of the Phoenix, when she sees their success, she is speechless. She hugs them. "You're doing really well." There's a beat of disbelief, but also of recognition. Her boys had made something real. Their jokes had become lifelines. Their dream, their childish, wild dream, had survived longer than most people's lives. There's something sacred about how they protected others' happiness. They built inventions not for war, but for laughter. Even their skiving snack boxes, designed to help students skip class, were made with thoughtfulness and care. There was genius behind the silliness, innovation born not of ambition but of love. They didn't want power. They wanted people to breathe, to smile, to feel like themselves in a world constantly threatening to crush the spirit. The Marauder's map, once owned by another group of mischief makers, was passed to Fred and George. It's fitting. The map represents a way of seeing the world not as it is, but as it could be. Full of secrets, passages, possibilities. It's the lens of youth. Fred and George held on to that lens longer than anyone else dared. Perhaps that's why their fall hits harder, because we hoped they'd be the exception, that the war wouldn't touch them, that laughter would be their shield. But magic, as always, has limits. There's an irony to how their story ends. Voldemort wanted to destroy the spirit of resistance. Fred and George were his opposite. He dealt in fear, they dealt in fun, he silenced, they spoke in puns, and yet one of them still died. Does that mean Voldemort won? No, because in every corner of Hogwarts, in every quiet chuckle students share, in every forbidden spell miscast just to see what happens, Fred lives on. Not as a ghost, but as a memory of what was good and right. Their story reminds us of Peter Pan, boys who didn't want to grow up. But in the wizarding world there's no Neverland, just war and pain and loss. Yet even in that world, Fred and George carved out a place for colour, for rebellion through whimsy, for brotherhood that felt eternal, and when it shattered, we all felt it, because losing Fred meant losing the illusion that laughter alone could save us. But maybe that's too harsh. Maybe the lesson isn't that joy fails, but that it's worth having, even for a while. Fred's laughter echoes louder because it stopped. George's silence means more because it once was filled with noise. And the Weasley twins, those glorious boys who filled Hogwarts with chaos, gave us a glimpse of a world where jokes were acts of courage, and where refusing to grow up was the bravest choice of all. And even now, as readers revisit their story, we cling to their memory like a charm. When the world feels heavy, when adulthood bites down hard, we think of them, of fireworks in the great hall, of enchanted sweets, of two boys, inseparable, who reminded us that joy is not the absence of pain, it is defiance in the face of it. Fred and George didn't fail to grow up. They chose another way, and Fred died for it, and George lived with it. And somewhere between those two truths, we remember what it means to be young, even when the world demands otherwise. Number 28, controlling the social hierarchy through fear. It was not fear of fists or hexes that made Fred and George Weasley so influential at Hogwarts. It was the subtle, creeping fear of laughter. Not the warm, inclusive laughter that brightened the Gryffindor common room after dinner, but the sharp, precise kind that cut into you when you realized it was directed at you, and that the entire room was in on the joke. Fred and George were never bullies in the way Draco Malfoy and his goons were. They didn't shove students into walls or use status as a weapon, but they were feared, and that fear was laced into every corner of Hogwarts like the scent of one of their fireworks, colourful, loud, and impossible to escape. Take the case of first-year Dennis Creevey. Wide-eyed, jittery, and constantly snapping photos with his muggle camera, Dennis was the perfect target, too enthusiastic, too naive, and far too easy to embarrass. One evening, as he followed his older brother Colin into the common room, Dennis made the mistake of asking, in a voice too loud and too hopeful, whether Fred and George might let him try one of their skiving snack boxes. The room went quiet for a second. Fred looked up from the game of exploding snap and smirked. "Only if you promise not to cry when your ears fall off," he said, producing a packet of bright blue candies. George added, "And don't worry, we can always use a new tester. It builds character." The common room laughed, and Dennis turned red, mumbling something before disappearing up the staircase. That moment stayed with him, and he never asked again. Fred and George's humour was a double-edged sword. On one side it brought joy, pure, raucous joy. Their pranks during Umbridge's reign were nothing short of legendary. Fireworks shaped like dragons swooping through hallways, enchanted swamps flooding corridors, enchanted notes bursting into rude jingles. They brought rebellion to a school under siege. But the other edge, the sharper one, was the casual cruelty that sometimes lurked in their words. The Weasley twins had the rare ability to make the entire school laugh at someone with just a glance or a well-timed punchline, and no one wanted to be that someone. Their power came not from a wand, but from timing, from understanding the rhythm of a conversation and twisting it until it served them. Lee Jordan once joked that being friends with Fred and George was like riding a hippogriff blindfolded, thrilling until you realized you were inches from falling. Even friends weren't safe. Ron, their own brother, was often at the receiving end of jokes that made him grit his teeth. During his first Quidditch match, Fred shouted across the pitch, "Oi, Ron, don't fall off! Mum just polished your broom!" It earned laughs, but also tightened the tension in Ron's shoulders. Being the punchline wasn't a choice, it was a consequence of proximity. What made it worse was the twins' absolute confidence in their charm. They walked through Hogwarts like they owned the place, not out of arrogance, but because they knew they were entertaining. Students watched them like one watches fireworks, dazzled, impressed, and praying they wouldn't land too close. There was power in that. Even teachers gave them a wide berth. Professor Flitwick once tried to lecture them about respecting academic property after one of their magical posters wandered into his classroom and mooned the class. He ended up chuckling halfway through the reprimand. And yet there was a line, an invisible one, perhaps known only to Fred and George. They rarely crossed into real malice, but their proximity to that line meant they often played with it, danced along its edge. Some students whispered that being on the bad side of the twins meant your hair might turn purple for a week or your quill might write love notes to the wrong person. And while these things were never confirmed, the fear was enough to keep most from challenging them. Fear wrapped in laughter is still fear, and for many students, especially the younger ones, Fred and George were both heroes and hazards. Even Hermione Granger, never one to cower, found herself on the defensive around them. She once remarked, "Honestly, they're brilliant, but they think everything's a joke. Some things aren't." It was after they slipped a fanged flyer into a Slytherin's bag, which had erupted during potions class. Snape had nearly had a stroke and Hermione had scolded them in the hallway, but Fred had only grinned and said, "A little chaos keeps the world spinning, Granger." George added, "Besides, it was Crabbe. He wouldn't notice the difference between a fanged flyer and a regular quill if it bit him." And it wasn't just the students. The very walls of Hogwarts seemed to respond to the Weasley twins. Their laughter echoed longer, their tricks lingered in the air like perfume. When they finally left the school, in a blaze of fireworks and rebellion against Umbridge, it wasn't just a political act. It was a reminder of how deep their presence ran. Even the suits of armor seemed to stand straighter when they passed. And when they were gone, Hogwarts felt dimmer, quieter, but also, to some, safer. Fear doesn't always wear a scowl. Sometimes it wears a grin and tells jokes. Fred and George used their wit like a sword. Playful, but sharp. Their jokes were often hilarious, but the edge of danger made people laugh louder than they felt comfortable. There was always a question, was I laughing because it was funny, or because I didn't want to be next? Consider Alicia Spinnet, a fellow Gryffindor and chaser on the Quidditch team. During one particularly stressful week before exams, Fred and George decided to lighten the mood by enchanting the notice board to sing all exam schedules in an operatic falsetto. Alicia, already sleep-deprived and anxious, snapped at them. "Not funny," she muttered, pulling down the parchment. Fred raised his eyebrows and replied, "Don't worry, Alicia. Even if you fail, we'll make you our official singing parchment model." Laughter erupted, and Alicia forced a smile. Later that evening, she was seen studying in a corner, clearly shaken. She wasn't the target, not really, but the message was clear. Push back, and you'll be part of the joke. The effect was cumulative. Over time, students learned to laugh on cue. Younger students avoided eye contact. Even the most outspoken knew that a clever comment from Fred could make you a running joke for a week. There's a passage in Order of the Phoenix where Fred tells Harry, "You're in our top 10 favourite people, you know, and not just because you're a good target for testing skiving snack boxes." It was a joke, but it also wasn't. To be in their top 10 meant you were safe, or at least safer. But fear isn't just what's done, it's what's imagined. And Fred and George cultivated that imagination. Their products at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes were full of warnings: may cause unexpected transformations, use with caution, do not ingest unless you're really, really sure. They built their brand on unpredictability. That same unpredictability followed them in school. You never knew what they might do, and that made them dangerous, in the most charming school spirit way possible. It's easy to forget that humor can be weaponized. Fred and George mastered that weapon early. Even Percy Weasley, their older brother and often the brunt of their jokes, once said, "They think everything's a joke. They'll grow up when the world stops laughing." But the world never really did. They learned to wield laughter like a wand to transfigure fear into applause. Yet, to their credit, Fred and George never picked on the weak. They didn't mock Neville for his clumsiness or Luna for her oddness. Not cruelly, at least. But they did hold a mirror to people, and sometimes that reflection wasn't kind. Humor that relies on fear walks a tightrope, and they walked it with a swagger that made it look easy. In the end, their rule at Hogwarts was not a dictatorship, but a performance. And like any performance, it demanded attention. Those who clapped loudest were rarely picked on. Those who didn't, well, they risked becoming part of the act. Theirs was a reign not of violence, but of volume. And when the laughter stopped, you realized it had been a shield, one that protected them and controlled others. Fred and George were masters of the stage, and Hogwarts was their theatre. They were beloved, admired, and yes, feared. But fear doesn't have to shout. Sometimes it just raises an eyebrow, cracks a joke, and waits for the room to laugh, even if it's laughing for the wrong reasons.